5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe what you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. That's Morpheus talking to Neo in the first of the Matrix films. And it is a stated example of crossing the threshold. What happens immediately afterwards is Neo crosses the threshold into the other world. And there's no turning back. And welcome back to Quantum Froth Dispatches. This is Michael Haspel. And this is part 2 of the Monomyth. I'm using the term by Joseph Campbell. Actually, I don't think Campbell coined it. I think it was maybe James Joyce, but Campbell certainly co-opted it and gave it its meaning that we understand today. So I'm going to try to go from crossing the threshold to the Supreme Ordeal. And we're going to do a little bit of a recap just so we can get our bearings here before we get going. Also, this segment is kind of fraught with pitfalls that have to do with psychology and religion and sociology also come into play and everything. I will try to keep this as out of the psychological realm as I can, but on some of these it will be nigh impossible. So let's get going. We'll see how far we can get. If I can knock everything out in this episode, then we might only have part 3 instead of a 4-part series. The original reason I wanted a 4-part series is because I tend, if you look at the Monomyth cycle as a huge circle, I like to draw a cross in the middle of that circle and separate the circle into 4 parts. So that would be Act 1 would be the first part where it goes from the ordinary world to crossing the threshold. Act 2 would be going the entire bottom half of the circle, but broken into 2 parts, separated by the Supreme Ordeal in the middle. And then Act 3 is the return, going from the crossing the threshold back into the ordinary world and becoming master of both worlds, etc., etc. So as a quick recap, if we look at that circle and think of it as the face of a clock, the ordinary world would be 12 o'clock, noon. And then crossing the first threshold, which is 3 o'clock, and we covered all the stuff in between, because there are stages in between, in the last podcast, in part 1. And going from the first threshold, crossing the first threshold at 3 o'clock, we're going to head now to the Supreme Ordeal, which is generally the middle of Act 2. And that's going to be the Supreme Ordeal. And then from the Supreme Ordeal, we now go to flight or crossing the threshold again. Some people call it the third threshold because they put the Supreme Ordeal as the second threshold. And that is going from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And then 9 o'clock is you're now entering the third act and wrapping up your story, coming into the ordinary world again, going from 9 o'clock to noon. And a lot of folks that, we're actually hardwired for story. We love stories. That's the way our brains work. We always try to make a story out of everything. And a lot of times we are disappointed when things do not match a 3-act structure. So you've made the requisite sacrifices, you've gone through the Supreme Ordeal, and where's the reward? Usually there is no reward. It's just get back on the mill and start making the sacrifices again. And that leads to a lot of disappointment and everything, because folks have been trained, especially say in the last 50 years or so, by film, to it almost seems like a shortcut. It's like, hey, you don't need to put in years at the gym. You just need a Rocky style montage and you're going to be fine. And we tend to internalize those ideas and believe things that are patently not true. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a segue here before going into this. What we can say is that the monomyth, the cycle of the monomyth is true. And it is something that if we train ourselves to expect and understand that, it fits our lives much better than a 3-act structure. And the reason we know that is because the monomyths, all the myths that Campbell studied to come up with the monomyth cycle, they were created, the myths were created to help us get through life. They're essentially software instructions for our brains on how to get through certain situations, how to get through life. And they're, of course, not just spelled out normally, because that would only apply to a very, very specific situation. So they are relayed to us in code down through the ages. And, I'm forgetting something really quick. Where I'm pulling this information from are from 2 sources primarily. Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is an outstanding book. And I recommend it to anybody who is an aspiring storyteller, whether you're a GM all the way to being a novelist to a filmmaker or whatever. You should read this book. The other book is called The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, where he's taken a lot of Campbell's tenets out of the Heroes of 1,000 Faces and distilled it, like made it more easily digestible for a modern audience. Campbell's work is an academic work, whereas Vogler's work is not an academic work. It's more, hey, here's how you can use these to tell a story. There is a third book out there that I highly recommend if you're going to try to be a storyteller, and it's Stealing Hollywood: Screenwriting Tricks for Authors by Alexandra Sokoloff. She has done an amazing job of distilling all these storytelling ideas into one volume. And it used to be ebook only, but if you go through CreateSpace, I believe that that's what it goes through. You can get like a textbook type paperback version of it, which I have, and I highly recommend it over the ebook version, because this is the kind of book you're going to want to reference and tab and highlight and put notes in and everything. So in my opinion, the hard copy is, if you're only going to buy one version, buy the hard copy. If you buy the Kindle version too. These are it's not that expensive. But to jump back into the monomyth cycle and why it becomes real, and it's kind of, that's the way we're conveying to oncoming generations, to other people, how to get through experiences in life. And the idea is from this, I mean, it comes from when we started living together as human beings. Humans started telling each other stories, and we may not think of it that way, but that's what was happening. And it may not be an elaborate story. It might just be, well, don't go near the creek because at certain times of the year, the creek will overflow, and et cetera, and we've lost people down there that were down by the creek and they died. And well, you can't tell everybody that story and they're going to be bored to tears, and most of them don't care. And they're like, well, I'm not as stupid as those people. I'm just going to go down by the creek. So it's much easier to say the river god doesn't want you to go down by the creek or he will kill you. And that becomes a story. And people start believing that, and they start shaping their behavior based on something completely fictional, something completely made up, just to keep people from going down the creek and drowning, because halfway through the year, the creek rises and it turns into a floodwater, and it's not safe to go down there. So things get more and more elaborate. They build elaborate rituals around it. And these rituals happen to coincide with when the creek is safe to go down by. And they go, oh, well, the river god was appeased because of this festival, and now it's okay for you to go down by the creek. And people start living their lives according to these stories. And they don't have to be religious in nature. They can be any kind of story. Like, we all tell ourselves a story that pieces of green paper are valuable. And if we all stopped believing that, the economy would stop working. But because we all believe the same fiction, it works. We all go, well, this green piece of paper is only worth one of something, and this green piece of paper is worth 100 of something. And yes, you guys know I'm a big fan of Rick and Morty. Rick makes a direct reference to this. He takes the galactic currency and makes it one that is worth one of something and makes it worth zero of something. And he's able to topple the entire galactic government because of that. So that brings me to, there was a book by Yuval Noah Harari, and it's called Sapiens. And I highly recommend it. It is not really about storytelling. It is kind of a history of the human race. But in it, he talks about how humans make up, or sapiens, he calls them, make up fictions. And that's why we rule the world. And it's just really an interesting thing. And I'm going to read a passage to you. And I don't think this is from the book. I think this is a passage where it's paraphrased from an interview that he gave about the book. And this is Yuval Noah Harari. When I look at history, for me the big question is, what is real and what are fictions created by human beings? And at least my understanding is that a source of human power, but also the source of so much human misery, is the human imagination. And the ability of humans to create fictional stories and then believe them to such an extent that they can start entire wars just because they believe some religious or national or economic fiction. And this is what really gave us control of the planet. We control this planet not because as individuals we are much more intelligent than chimpanzees or pigs or dogs, but rather because we are the only mammal that can cooperate in very, very large numbers. And we do that because we believe in fictions. If you examine any large-scale human cooperation, you always find a fictional story as the basis, whether it is about God or the nation or money or even human rights. Human rights, like God in heaven, are just a story invented by humans. They are not a biological reality. And this is the source of our power, and again, the source of many of our calamities. You could never convince a group of chimpanzees to attack the neighboring group by promising them that after they die, if they die for the great chimpanzee God or the great chimpanzee nation, that after they die, they will go to chimpanzee heaven and receive lots of bananas and virgin chimpanzees and things like that. No chimpanzee will ever believe such a story. And this is why we control the world and not the chimpanzees. Not all stories are the same, and some stories are much more beneficial than other stories, and also they demand different kinds of belief. So that's pretty powerful, and it rings true when I hear it, and that's why I wanted to highlight that. And the way we look at the world, everything gets turned into a story. That's why our media calls things that are supposed to be facts stories. You know, what's the story behind this? What's the news story? It's not an accident we're using that word. And when there isn't a narrative that fits a story construct, they invent it. The newspaper stories create a narrative that we can more easily digest. This shows up everywhere in our world. Every television commercial is a little tiny myth about how if you use a particular product, your life will be better. And they're trying to convince you of that. And if you believe it, and then it succeeds in sales. And there might be, in the case of a television commercial, that's pretty innocuous. They're just like, hey, if you get this vacuum cleaner, if you use our shampoo, you're going to be more attractive. If you use this whatever product, then your life is better. And it's usually so short, and we've become more savvy over the years that we understand that, hey, a commercial is just trying to sell you something. They're, at the bottom level, they're all snake oil salesmen. And yes, their product might actually be better and might actually make your life easier, but it's not everything they're telling you is true. However, where things becomes dangerous is when people take these stories and are making longer narratives out of it. And it's not just, hey, your life is going to be better. It's they need a villain. Every story, every powerful story needs a villain. It needs someone to blame. And so you see that Coke is not just about, hey, drink Coke and it's a great product. It's drink Coke, we're better than Pepsi. And then Pepsi initiates the Pepsi Challenge because they want to prove that they're better than Coke. All these things start to grow out. In news stories, or not even the news. I'm going to try to keep this, as just fun as possible. Let's just take just the media in general, like just a pop culture media thing, right? Is you don't have to, nowhere does it say that if you like Star Wars, by definition, you don't like Star Trek. That actually doesn't make any sense. But when the media tells stories, when they cover Comic-Con, when they cover, any kind of fan event involving Star Wars or Star Trek, they kind of go out of their way collectively. It's almost like they don't even agree to it. They go out of their way collectively to pose that there's a rivalry there. And there really isn't. If you're going to Comic-Con or any of these fan events, you're there because you're into the same kind of celebrating the pop culture. Now, every story may not be for you. You may not even know about some of the stories, but it doesn't mean that you hate them. But when you watch a lot of the stuff in the media, it's when they report about it, right? It's DC versus Marvel. And it's not. You can like both. You can, hey, I just enjoy stories about superheroes. And when they're well told and well made, I like them, period. And when they're not well made and have a lot of problems, I don't like them, period. But they really want to create that whole DC versus Marvel, Star Wars versus Star Trek, et cetera, et cetera. And when you carry those kind of narratives beyond something as, say, not as stakes heavy as pop culture, you start getting into a lot of trouble, because now you can create narratives about other tribes that don't have to have anything to do with reality. They just enable you to justify whatever you're going to do to that other tribe. And it's just kind of, there's an article on Cracked, of all things, from, I don't know, maybe at least 5 years ago, called 5 Ways You Don't Realize Movies Are Controlling Your Brain by David Wong. And he has a photo in there of, I want to say it's a Maasai warrior. It is an African tribesman. And the caption underneath the picture sums this up so perfectly. It goes, why don't we all just pick fruit and have sex together? Oh, they worship a baby-eating demon? Well, that changes everything. And so it's like, oftentimes, the reason that we form ourselves into tribes and hate our opponents have nothing to do with what our opponents are actually in reality being or consisting of or anything. It usually has to do with what our opponents believe. And when you start to break it down, a lot of these beliefs are not facts. They're not reality. They're not driven by biology or even science. They're driven by belief. They're driven by what stories people tell. So if you distill that again, why must we hate our opponents? Because they tell different stories. And that's how powerful stories are. And the monomyth is key to that. So one thing that should really set alarm bells off is understand that the people telling these stories, they're not doing these things by accident. Hollywood is a multi-billion, trillion-dollar industry, not because people just happen to tell cool stories by accident. They know this stuff. They've known this stuff for years. Disney has been using the monomyth since its inception. Pixar, all these studios, all these places use these constructs because they're the way that you're used to receiving stories, and subconsciously you will start to accept it. But what you need to watch out for is when an organization or whatever starts to champion one narrative at the expense of all the others. So all the other narratives are invalid. This is the one true way. That should give you pause. And for a lot of people, it doesn't give them pause because they already agree with it, or they were raised with that story. And that was all they knew until they were old enough to hear other stories. And then they heard other stories and went, that's different than what I know. And being different, I already don't like it. And then when they question something, somebody says, well, no, the story we already told you, that's the only way that things go. And those other people are evil because of their story. So I think that's enough seriousness for this episode. And we'll just delve into some examples. We'll start with the threshold crossing where we left off last time. And just as a quick recap, the hero starts in the ordinary world. There's their, everyday world. They get a call to adventure, and they either accept or refuse the call. If they refuse the call, we are kind of done with the story because they stay home. They don't, with that version of the story. We may get another story with the same hero, but it won't be the story that we got for that particular call to adventure. And then we move on. They meet a mentor or some supernatural aid. They get a bunch of different helpers, and they go to the threshold crossing. And the threshold is usually a physical place, but it doesn't have to be. If the story is internal or emotional in nature, it could be just a point of no return where the character realizes that they need to change. Change needs to happen. So I started off with the quote from The Matrix because it was a really, really good example of what crossing the threshold can be. So, of course, Neo takes the red pill, and almost immediately he gets to see the world that he knows physically warps and changes. And then very, very shortly, he finds himself in this kind of technological nightmare world, but it is actually a totally different world. He is now in the special world. And when Morpheus' crew finds him and everything, Morpheus is like, welcome to the real world, And this strange world, this is the world that, in Alice in Wonderland, it's the which the Matrix references. It is the world in the rabbit hole. Where laws don't, they don't follow the laws of the real world, or through the looking glass. It's the world on the other side of the looking glass. Often it is a point of no return, at this point in the story. There's no going back. The only way to go back is to actually go through. So you can't just turn around and go, oh, well, I'm done. And an example, a little quote from it is from Lord of the Rings. Sam Gamgee says, if I take one more step, I'll be the furthest from home I've ever been. And that's kind of what he's alluding to. And he dramatically takes one more step. Now, of course, we know he's going to take, thousands of more steps as he goes to Mount Doom with Frodo. But it's just a symbolic moment that he's just like, okay, I've decided to go on this adventure. And by taking that extra step, there's no, well, you know what, Frodo, I saw you to the end of the Shire, and see you later. Hope you succeed. He's symbolically showing that he's gonna go on and help Frodo all the way to the bitter end. So that brings us to, now that they've crossed the threshold, our hero or heroes are now going to be on the road of trials. And so when you cross the threshold of adventure, you now undertake the road of trials. Joseph Campbell breaks it up into different kinds of, trials, for lack of a better word. Brother battle, dragon battle, dismemberment, crucifixion, abduction, night sea journey, and the wonder journey. And we're not going to go in depth into all of these because it really would take way more time than we have. And but the idea behind it is that these stages, they don't always all happen. So for instance, a hero that undergoes brother battle might not undergo crucifixion because there are different kinds of stories that include these things in there. They're separate stages and just categorize the method in which the hero crosses the threshold and perhaps what method they use when confronting their particular threshold guardian. So brother battle and dragon battle describe a situation where the hero either placates or overcomes the threshold guardian and is able to pass victorious and still living, hopefully, and whole in the world of adventure. So this would be your traditional mythic structure. The hero has to fight or slay a monster that guards a gate or a treasure or something. It's your standard mythological story. The threshold guardian is there, it's Cerberus or something, and the hero can do battle with the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to Hades and defeat him, or he might just bring a piece of meat to placate and distract him, and then he just defeats the threshold guardian and moves on. The second case is called dismemberment and or crucifixion. There's slightly different connotations with each one, but they describe a different situation wherein the hero loses the threshold guardian and is slain and somewhat forced across the threshold of adventure. A good example of this is The Fugitive. Dr. Kimball actually loses to the one-armed man because he is metaphorically slain. His old life is over. His life is destroyed. He's thrust into the underworld of being on the run from the authorities and the law. And that now defines him. Another really good example in one of my favorite films, so I keep going back to it, is Gladiator. The threshold guardian in this case is also kind of a villain. He is the villain of the film. It's Commodus, so Maximus has an opportunity to placate or slay or however, talk to Commodus in a way that would appease him so that Commodus would trust Maximus. But instead, he essentially all but accuses Commodus of murdering his father to his face, which for a Roman general probably wasn't a smart thing to do. And then finds out that, oh, hey, your family is going to be murdered and we're going to take you out into the woods and murder you, and you're going to be done with. And he's able to escape from that. But from that moment on, he is in the other world where he is first a slave, then a gladiator, all the way back for him to go back to Rome and stand before the emperor and all that stuff and everything like that. But these are not things he really had a choice in. It was more he was dragged kicking and screaming across the threshold. And then we get Abduction, Nightseed Journey, and Wonder Journey, which is it's like an internal impetus or a force that it forces the hero to cross the threshold whether she likes it or not. A great example of this, which is different than Gladiator, even though he gets forced to cross the threshold, he kind of had an opportunity to placate the Threshold Guardian, and he just wasn't successful. And that's different than this example, which is Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. She doesn't get a say. There's no way for her to placate the Threshold Guardian or try to talk her way out of things or maybe come up with a different solution. She gets caught in a twister and winds up in Oz. There's no way around it. She has no volition. She has no amount of willpower would have kept her from winding up in Oz. And what's interesting is about this is it can set different kind of paradigms in motion. For instance, when Dorothy does get to Oz and she's talking to, I think it's Glinda. Glinda asks her a question and says, "Are you a good witch or a bad witch?" Because when she showed up, she killed the Wicked Witch of the East, like right away, by having her house fall on her. So when she's asked that question, and kind of it challenges her worldview, because up until that point, to Dorothy, there were no good witches. All witches were bad. And so when she's asked, are you a good witch or a bad witch? It's like, hey, wait a minute. There are good witches? What? But that's not tied to crossing the threshold. That's just an observation, a side thing. So now once you're on the road of trials, you'll enter something that occurs at about 4 o'clock, maybe 5 o'clock on the clock face. And it varies, and it can happen at the same time as the Supreme Ordeal as well. And a lot of people mistake this for the Black Moment. And the Black Moment is a shorthand that storytellers use to say that this is going to be when the hero faces their darkest hour, like the worst peril ever. And for me, the Black Moment, or is a different stage called like the Dark Night of the Soul, and that happens usually at about 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock on the clock face. So this next stage is about 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. We're moving towards the Supreme Ordeal, and it is Campbell calls it the belly of the whale, and it is a lot of times it is physically represented as a descent into the underworld or being engulfed by some kind of giant thing bigger than you. A really good example is in the Fellowship of the Ring. Gandalf, "Now we must brave the long dark of Moria. Let us hope that our passage goes unnoticed." And of course, it's not going to go unnoticed. And one of my favorite plays, Henry V, that is the Siege of Harfleur. It is the first time, our heroes have left. They've gone to France. This is the first big major battle we're able to witness, and the English are not doing well. I mean, this is the "once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more." It's that speech. And if you listen to the entire speech there, they have been pushed back several times already. And the next line is, "once more under the breach, or close the wall up with our English dead." Does that sound like somebody who's winning? No. That sounds like, hey, we've got one more chance at this, and we might as well just die if we don't make it. You know what I mean? That's what he's saying. And he's motivating his men in that scene, but they weren't exactly winning. This is not a good time for King Henry. So right before the hero reaches the Supreme Ordeal, which is coming up, they will reach a point where this is the belly of the whale. And at this stage, the hero will have appeared to be swallowed up by the opposition forces. To the outside world, the hero may actually appear to have died. So Christopher Vogler refers to this stage as the approach to the inmost cave. They're talking about the same thing. And their placement along the timeline is a little bit arbitrary. It generally happens before the hero achieves the Supreme Ordeal. And these are these little challenges that are in your story to not only test the hero and demonstrate that we've put our faith in the right person by following their story, but it's also the kind of thing that a lot of times you'll hear about people telling stories and they say that it has a sagging middle. The second act is too slow and stuff like that. These are the quote unquote action scenes that get tossed into the second act to keep things moving. Yet at the same time, it can't be a mindless action scene. It should have consequences. You know, if the hero messes this up, they could be proverbially dead and the adventure come to an end. So the hero will often appear to be physically swallowed up in something much larger. Some really good examples, Moria, of course, from Fellowship of the Ring, and Star Wars A New Hope, which is really easy to map the entire Monomyth to. Luke and company are swallowed into the Death Star, but their actual moment in the belly of the whale occurs when they're in the trash compactor, and it's mashing them over. And at a certain point at the end of that scene, 3PO and R2, well, 3PO at least, might actually think they're actually dead. Because when they're all celebrating that they've stopped the thing, he says, "Oh, I was too slow. Curse my metal body." So he actually thinks that they're dead at this point. And we have to assume that the Empire, I almost said Imperium because I play 40K too much, but the Empire has pretty much assumed that they're dead too, because they're not really looking for them. They're not scouring the Death Star going, "Hey, there's these guys running around. We know they broke somebody, a high value asset prisoner, out of the detention block." They're not really hunting for them anymore, or at least that we don't see. They're able to meet up and go and find the Millennium Falcon fairly easily. You know, with Leia's, famous line of, "You came in that thing? You're braver than I thought." So it's like, so the Empire almost assumes that they're dead. It's like, well, yeah, they went into the trash compactor and it closed, so they're done. We don't need to worry about them. Vader's not concerned about the companions that busted Leia out. He's concerned about Obi-Wan Kenobi. So it's just kind of an interesting side note there. And in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the belly of the whale occurs when Indy and Marion are locked inside the Well of the Souls by the Nazis, who also leave them for dead. So you kind of see a theme taking place here. In Ghostbusters, it happens a little bit later, and it's kind of the black moment actually in Ghostbusters. The belly of the whale, I think, in Ghostbusters coincides with part of the black moment, and it's when the Ghostbusters get taken to jail for violating EPA laws and causing an explosion. So they're thrown in jail. It seems like all is lost. Nobody's listening to them, and they're stuck there. And the thing that helps them, though, is that all of New York starts experiencing supernatural stuff, and the mayor is like, "Hey, get me the Ghostbusters." And I don't mean to give the idea that the belly of the whale always takes place indoors. It's just a crisis point where the hero is going to be tested and things start looking pretty bleak. So in like The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, in the film adaptation, the belly of the whale is the warg attack on the refugees from Rohan when they're evacuating over everybody to Helm's Deep, and the warg scouts catch up to the refugee column and attack them. But the bottom line of the whole belly of the whale thing happening is that the hero better get ready, because although he or she may escape from the belly intact, things are about to get really bad, and they are on the way to the Supreme Ordeal. And so now, we've got the belly of the whale along the road of trials. Also along the road of trials will be a series of smaller tests, and they're not as severe as, say, the belly of the whale, but they happen throughout. I'm choosing to talk about it right now. They actually happen throughout the entire road of trials, all of Act 2. And they're little tests. This is where the hero usually trips the signal alarms of the opposition, and the forces that work against him or her will become aware of their presence and start to consciously act against them. And that's early on. That's right when they cross the threshold. It usually happens before the belly of the whale, but can happen afterwards as well. It's just continuous all the way through. Their early trials, the hero can hone their skills that they will need later in the story. A really good example of this is in Raiders. Indy has to get the headpiece of the Staff of Ra and decipher the inscription on it, and then get to the map room and get back out without getting caught. And all that, of course, culminates in the whole Well of the Souls, them being trapped in the belly of the whale. They do occur after the belly of the whale and throughout. It's just different things in Star Trek II, which we're going to be covering in a couple of episodes. And I mean Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan from 1982, not Star Trek Into Darkness. But in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, we have all these tests that, Kirk has put through. Kind of the belly of the whale moment for that is, I would probably say, when they are trapped in the Genesis cage, or not cage, cave, where Khan thinks that he's stranded them in the Genesis cave. And we'll explore that more when we talk about Star Trek II. But the tests don't stop after that. They're ongoing. They're still going as Kirk tries to outsmart Khan. And that brings us to our next stage, right? So the Supreme Ordeal. And there are a couple of quotes that go right with this. The one that really comes to mind is from Fight Club and Tyler Durden. And he says, "Only after disaster can you be resurrected. It's only after you've lost everything that you're free to do anything." So that's what we're getting into. The Supreme Ordeal is usually the central crisis of the story. It's not the climax. That comes later in Act 3. In an action movie, it will be the big action set piece of the movie. This is like the Battle of Helm's Deep in The Two Towers. The key is that there's a central theme of death and change. So the hero will be submitted to death in some way or form. It could be failure of their mission, the end of a relationship, the loss of their mentor, or facing their greatest fear. This is usually where the hero will face the enemy for the first time in full form. And when I say enemy here, I mean enemy, capital E, an actual entity, not just stormtroopers. This is when you see Darth Vader in action for the first time. And it's bad news. So, prior to this stage, the hero's been battling cronies, stormtroopers, lackeys, henchmen, threshold guardians. The enemy was not really out to stop the hero at this point. But now the worst the enemy has is going to be tossed in the hero's way. Whatever the outcome, the hero will emerge changed. And what's this just kind of popped into my head, but what's really, really funny is if you think about all the earlier Nintendo type side scrollers, they actually follow the hero's journey pretty well. So this Supreme Ordeal is our princess is in another castle. Like, you made it all the way, you defeated Bowser's stuff, and you get there, no reward. You have to start all over. You're not out of this yet. That kind of thing. So it's just kind of funny. I'm like, oh yeah, with all the lesser bosses and everything, these are all the threshold guardians. You're stomping on Koopas and stuff if you're thinking about Super Mario, and then you're coming up to the Supreme Ordeal, the big boss fight. So, and you already know it's not the final boss fight if it's Final Fantasy or something. We have a good feel for, hey, well, we're about halfway through, and there was a huge boss fight here, but the game's not over. But Joseph Campbell breaks up the Supreme Ordeal into 4 different categories: sacred marriage, father atonement, apotheosis, and elixir theft. And all of them may take on a physical nature, but they are deeply psychological. This is where we get into Freud and Jung, and I don't want to get too bogged down into this because you can literally lose yourself following these archetypes, and the rabbit hole goes deep indeed. So not all of them take place in every Supreme Ordeal, but sometimes more than one takes place, and they can be mixed and matched. So the first one we're going to talk about, and maybe I'll just talk about 2 this time, and then pick up on the next part 3 with the other 2, and then go around just to try to spread the material more evenly. That seems like a good way to do it. We'll see what happens. We'll press on. So this next phase, Campbell calls sacred marriage. There's also a couple of other comments about it. Some people call it meeting with the goddess, or woman is a temptress. But those titles are somewhat misleading. And the woman is a temptress thing. It's just it's an archetype. It doesn't necessarily mean an actual woman tempting, anything sexual or whatever. Sometimes it does manifest itself as an actual woman. The easy one we just spoke about on a couple other podcasts was Valeria trying to talk Conan out of going and seeking Thulsa Doom. And she's like, hey, we have more treasure than we've ever had before. We are rich beyond anything. Let somebody else deal with Thulsa Doom. We don't have to mess with this. But I can actually think of a really good example where it is a very masculine figure that embodies this, and it's in First Blood by David Morrell. So in the film, at least, Colonel Troutman is talking to the sheriff, and the sheriff, he's trying to convince the sheriff that this is not a fight that he can win. And I think he uses the term like no-win scenario. And the sheriff says, well, what do you think I should do? And the sheriff is, of course, the bad guy in the movie. He's the villain, or the antagonist, rather. Not necessarily a villain, but an antagonist. And Troutman tells him, let John Rambo go. Just open up a hole, let him slip through. In 2 or 3 weeks, you'll catch him in, a car wash or something, and there won't be any fighting. You diffuse the whole situation. And the sheriff cannot deal with that. It is a temptation to just let the quest go. And now keep in mind, this is an antagonist that is reacting to this in this particular example, but to the sheriff, he's the hero of his own journey. He's not the bad guy. He's the hero. John Rambo's the bad guy. So I think the analogy still applies. So yeah, getting back to the whole idea of like the stage being referred to as meeting with the goddess or a woman as a temptress, it's somewhat misleading because it implies the presence and participation of a female or a feminine force. And oftentimes that is the case, but that's not necessarily has to be the case. If the hero is female, the sacred marriage would be with a male or masculine force. And in this stage, there may be an actual meeting with a goddess. So like Frodo meeting Galadriel, Luke meeting Leia, or the marriage may be between 2 halves of the hero in order to make him or her whole. So a couple of examples here is that when the hero meets with the goddess, one of the things that happens is that the goddess genuinely tells them the truth. And it's usually a truth that is unpalatable to the hero. And an example of this would be in Fellowship of the Ring, the film. Frodo says, speaking to Galadriel, says, "I know what I must do, but I do not think I can do it alone." And Galadriel just says, "You are a ring bearer, Frodo, and to bear a ring of power is to be alone." That is the last thing Frodo wanted to hear right then. He wanted some sympathy. He wanted some, oh, hey, that's rough and whatever, but Galadriel doesn't have time for that. And when they meet, when Han and Leia meet, Han and Luke meet Leia, she has nothing but scorn for them. She's like, "You two idiots, are basically succeeding through pure luck, So, for instance, at this stage, it is more of a sacred marriage between the two halves of a hero. So, for instance, a male hero is seeking out the anima, their inner feminine qualities, like intuition, which may have previously remained unrecognized. The female hero might be seeking out animus, which is a quality of authority which she's had to suppress due to society. So in either case, the hero will come out of the ordeal whole and complete for the first time. And it's at this stage that the hero will come to recognize inevitable truths regarding their situation. So at this point, it does require a joining to make the hero whole. So as a couple of quick examples, even the stoutest hero needs kind of the opposite. And this is where we can get really into Jung and Freud, really deep. And I'm just going to skim. So please forgive me if you disagree with some of the things I'm saying, and understand that I am just skimming the top of this and it goes way, way deeper. But the stoutest male hero needs the goddess. So in Star Wars, A New Hope, Luke is super rash and cocky and thinks that he can actually succeed at anything. He actually says things like, "You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself." He doesn't actually calculate the risks. The fact that Han and Luke actually decide to go and bluff their way into the detention center to save Leia is just absolutely insane. And it's only after they meet Leia that she adds any reason and logic to the adventure, because up until that point, these guys were just shooting from the hip. And by the way, Leia is the one that finds the escape route in the detention block, because Han and Luke were content to just stand in the hallway with no cover, blasting away at the door until they killed every stormtrooper on the Death Star, or they were killed themselves. When Neo is on the rooftop in The Matrix and he's actually figuring out how the agents move and dodging bullets and everything like that, he just did some incredibly magical feats, but he's about to get killed. And what does he say? "Trinity, help." It's Trinity that actually beats that agent with her famous line, "Dodge this," and she's like got the gun at point blank and everything. Of course, Conan the Barbarian, that we've already talked about this before. Valeria comes back from the dead to save Conan, or his head be split right open by Rexor. It's her sword blade from the beyond that deflects Rexor's blade and temporarily blinds him, so giving Conan a chance to get back to his feet. Works the other way too. Works in reverse. Ripley in Aliens, super badass, like amazing, right? Needs Hicks. When Newt and her are trapped in the med lab and the facehuggers coming and everything, she's essentially powerless. It takes Hicks to pull it off for her. Sarah Connor needs Reese. Katniss needs PETA. And Wonder Woman needs Steve Trevor. And that kind of, the whole Wonder Woman aspect lets me indulge in a side note here. Meeting with the goddess, it is not always a good thing. It is a lot of times portrayed as a good thing in pop culture. They'll be like, "Oh, hey, there's Aphrodite, and you get to meet Aphrodite, and is she fantastic?" And this is a very short-sighted, male-centric view of meeting with the goddess, because when you think about a lot of the goddesses that are out there, many of them are mother figures, but many of them are kind of angry mother figures. So I can think right off the top of my head of goddesses that I would not want to meet, and it's Kali or the Morrigan, or to go to Egypt because I have, I'm an Egyptophile. So Sekhmet, who when they wanted to punish mankind, the gods didn't send, Horus or Osiris or even Set. They sent Sekhmet, and she is a lioness goddess, and she came down and killed so many humans that the gods were like, oh man, we messed up, and they couldn't calm her down. So they took beer and dyed it so it looked like blood. And she, in her bloodlust, she was drinking all the blood, wind up getting drunk, passed out, and then that's how they were able to get her to calm down. And then the whole tie-in to Wonder Woman is there's a story about a guy named Actaeon who wanted to see the goddess Artemis, and she's a hunter goddess, and he was a hunter, so he went and suspected that he suspected she was in a certain area bathing in the nude, and he wanted to catch a glimpse of this goddess. So he went and snuck and was able to catch her in the nude as she was bathing, and he got to see Artemis in her unprotected form. And she turned him into a stag, and then his own hounds chased him down and ate him. And Artemis's other name is Diana. So Steve Trevor better watch out because it might or might not be a good thing. And it ties into the whole Oedipal complex and the Electra complex and all this other stuff that we could go into. But in the interest of time and incompleteness, I should say, we're going to move on from the meeting with the goddess, and we're going to move on to one of the other phases of the Supreme Ordeal, which is called Father Atonement. So where sacred marriage or meeting with the goddess has to do with the point where the hero will experience the power and significance of the all-powerful, all-encompassing kind of almost unconditional love. Father Atonement, or atonement with the Father, is where the hero must confront or be initiated by whatever holds the ultimate power in his or her life. So in many myths, that is actually the father or a father figure. In Conan, even though it wasn't his actual dad, it was Thulsa Doom. But, and of course, the most obvious example of atonement with the Father, no, I am your father. From Empire Strikes Back. It's really, really obvious. And Joseph Campbell likes to emphasize the spelling of this phase. And in his words, it's not simply atonement, but at one-ment with the father or father figure. And the father in Freudian terms represents an ogre figure, competitive and an authoritative force that wants to keep the individual from succeeding. So the ogre aspect of this father is a mirror image with one's own ego. So in the atonement with the father stage, one must first slay the ogre of their superego and id, and what is left is the ego, which you also have to defeat and move on, but not at this stage. It's why most of the time, like, teenage sons rebel against their fathers because the instinct against the father is one of rebellion. So teenage sons will rebel against their fathers only to discover when they get older that their fathers only wanted the best of them to begin with, but they didn't see it that way. They thought, it's all Obi-Wan's fault. He's holding me back. Does sound familiar? And in that classic example we just used, when Darth Vader says, no, I am your father, Luke's immediate answer is one of rejection and rebellion. No, I'll never join you. That's what he says. But then in Return of the Jedi, he actually surrenders to his father. And it's basically counting on his father's mercy to not only bring his father's character back from the dark side, but also in order to complete his own hero's journey and save the galaxy. At this stage also, if we reverse it, it could be part of the Electra complex, which is the pseudo opposite of the Oedipal complex. And the Oedipal complex is when a male hero will want union with their mother. The Electra complex is kind of the opposite, where a female hero will want union with the father. And that gets way into Freudian psychology and all kinds of stuff like that. But in like Rogue One at this stage, this is when Jyn Erso wants to go to Edu to rescue her father, and essentially because they've lost her father's message that is saying that, hey, I have planted a trap in the Death Star. I've planted a bug, and it can be defeated and blown up, and they've lost the message, and she wants to go to Edu to rescue not just her father's message, but to rescue her father and redeem her father in the eyes of everybody. And it's interesting to note that occurs almost exactly at about an hour into the movie, Rogue One. And it's generally, the midpoint of Act 2. And in film, it's really easy to tell. Sometimes they move the Supreme Ordeal to a little bit later. One of the interesting constructs of this that I can think of is The Lord of the Rings, especially The Return of the King. And we will have to talk about that next time. So in the next episode, part 3, we will cover the next 2 parts of the Supreme Ordeal, which are the apotheosis and the elixir theft. And then we'll make it to at least to recrossing the threshold. And if not, we might just press and end the whole thing instead of going into 3 parts, because I know folks are hopefully cranking on NaNoWriMo and still going and everything like that. And this is just important stuff for you to have by December, when you hopefully have set your nano work aside for a week or 2, and now you're going to like review it and start to look at it critically and turn on your inner editor. So for now, we're going to call it here. I'm Mike Haspel. Keep it clean and green until next time. Mike out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.